Is there any actual truth behind the folklore of the vampire? How could the dead possibly return to feed on the living? Even considering this as an actual question worthy of investigation seems preposterous to the modern mind. But nonetheless, it stands to reason that there must be a reason for these practically universal beliefs which have recurred throughout history. And to this day, the image of the vampire still lurks within our collective consciousness. In the conclusion to our study, we are asking why. And to do this, we will explore occult principles of what is referred to as spiritual science, as well as psychology, in considering the possibility of a real phenomenon at work, be it somatic or within the mind. In seeking this deeper understanding, we will expand our concept of the vampire, diving into the annals of folklore around the world, revealing a host of dark entities which were said to steal the blood or life force of human beings. The popular image of the vampire may give the impression that this sinister act was relegated to the lately deceased, but this is far from the truth. Join me as we encounter the terror of vampirism in all its modalities, from the metaphysical to the material, from energy siphoning spirits to reanimated corpses, to the archetype of the living vampire, practitioners of black magic, uncovering the dark truth behind the myth. Welcome to the Hidden Passage. In part 1 of this series, we discussed beliefs regarding the occult properties of blood, as well as the spiritual makeup of the human being. Perhaps these insights can help us to understand the vampire. As mentioned in the last episode, there is an idea that suggests that the vampire is essentially a residual aspect of the soul, the etheric body, which remains tied to the corpse after death, temporarily leaving its corporeal vessel to feed. Dr. Pierre Art provided the following explanation, quote, "Poor dead cataleptics, buried as if really dead, in cold and dry spots where morbid causes are incapable of affecting the destruction of their bodies. The astral spirit, enveloping itself in a fluidic ethereal body, is prompted to quit the precincts of the tomb and exercise on living bodies acts peculiar to physical life, especially that of nutrition, the result of which, by a mysterious link between soul and body which spiritualistic science will someday explain, is forwarded to the material body lying still within its tomb, and the latter is thus helped to perpetuate its vital existence." Dudley Wright elaborates on this premise, noting that, quote, "It is held that this ethereal form can go wherever it pleases, and that it is possible for this body to feed on human victims and carry the sustenance to the corpse lying within the tomb, by means of an invisible cord of connection, the nature of which is at present unknown." This would explain many of the anomalies presented in vampire cases, which are seen to disappear, and the lack of any evidence that the vampire had physically left its coffin. There are also cases where staking was ineffective, and the vampire plague ended only when the bodies were completely destroyed. As we have now learned that the etheric body is tied to blood, the vampire's need to procure it begins to make more sense. Perhaps the blood is not only formed by the etheric body, but feeds back into it and sustains it, circulating life essence across the spiritual bodies like it circulates through the physical body. The formation of the vampire can perhaps be further understood by looking at the Kabbalistic belief regarding the soul and the process of its deconstruction at the time of a person's death. Occultist Rufus Opus writes, "The human spirit consists of 4 parts, according to the traditional Kabbalah. They are the neshama, or eternal spark of God, the ruach, or the mind-self part, the nephesh, responsible for the survival instinct and autonomous activities of the flesh, and the guf, which is literally the body itself. The neshama is eternal and reincarnates. The ruach is immortal and rests until the neshama it sprang from is finished with the cycle of reincarnation. The nephesh and the guf are mortal aspects of the spirit that die and return to the earth. The nephesh continues to live for about 6 weeks after the body dies. It is mostly invisible, but can be seen by some people more easily than others. The nephesh is a living entity, like the body, and it needs sustenance to survive. The nephesh usually starves and returns to the earth after 6 weeks. Offerings to the memory of the person it was attached to can keep the nephesh alive. Ancestor worshippers have generations of nepheshim who serve as guardians of the family that honors them. They can become something akin to the house gods of Rome, domestic deities that aid in peace and prosperity of the home. The nephesh is not fully conscious, nor even very human at all. It is a shadow, and it may contain some memories of its life, but they are hazy at best. Recall that in Europe, the custom was to wait 6 weeks before checking for decomposition, the same amount of time the nephesh or etheric body stays in the corpse. The Chinese held a similar belief in a person having 2 souls, one of which could linger after death and become a vampire. Allegedly, there were sorcerers that could exploit this process, not only keeping the spirits of the dead alive, but raising them up to do their bidding.
Sutta Bana Makanash.
This brand of sorcery was known as necromancy. In Greece and Rome, these notorious necromancers were known as the Ghouls. The Melanesian Talamur went about this by eating a small piece of the corpse, which was believed to give them control over the ghost within it, thus becoming his servitor. There is also the remarkable account of a renowned offspring of the Vrikolakas, who had unique power over vampires, and were often sought for aid in laying troublesome spirits. In Russia, people believed that vampires could be created through copulation between a witch and a werewolf or devil. Not only could these left-hand practitioners allegedly create and control vampires, but they could actually themselves become them. A last consideration is the possibility that the vampire did not feed on blood at all, but instead pure energy. Perhaps then that energy prevents the physical body from shutting down completely and so it continues to produce its own blood. In all my research, I was not able to find one account where the victim was actually proven to be drained of blood or had any visible bite marks, nor could I find any victims attesting to this happening. Most of the time they would simply see an apparition of the deceased before suffering unexplained illness. That the vampire drank blood seems to be an assumption made because the victims were often pale and suffered symptoms that could be likened to blood loss, while the bodies of the vampires appeared to have an overabundance of blood. We may indeed be dealing with an entirely spiritual phenomenon. In fact, the oldest and most common form of vampiric entity was incorporeal. Furthermore, many cases in the 18th century feature entirely spiritual phenomena as well. Perhaps the true nature of the vampire, then, was misunderstood by an increasingly materialist culture in the Age of Enlightenment. Rudolf Steiner referred to these spectral forms as energy vampires. These are hostile beings which find nourishment not from the blood of humans, but from the negative energy they produce, much like the astral larva described by Paracelsus we covered in the episode on demons. Steiner believed these entities exist in the spiritual realm, and it is there that they must be confronted, like the shamans who embarked on the spirit journeys to conquer the sources of mental anguish for their patients. Quote, "Everything that feeds on negative feelings, on anxiety, fear and superstition, despair or doubt, are in reality hostile forces in supersensible worlds, launching cruel attacks on human beings while they are being fed. Therefore, it is above all necessary to begin with that the person who enters the spiritual world overcomes fear, feelings of helplessness, despair, and anxiety." Rufus Opus corroborates this theory of the etheric body becoming a vampire. Quote, "Nepheshim also seem to be able to feed on strong emotions and on geomagnetic currents. People in extreme stages of grief often see glimpses of the people they are mourning. This occurs when the spirit is able to consume some of the raw emotion and is empowered sufficiently to appear to the person grieving. In rare cases, the nephesh can become a psychic vampire, learning to draw life from the living by stimulating strong emotions of fear, passion, or despair. The following are two accounts of what could be classified as energy vampires. The first account states, "A young lady had an admirer who asked her in marriage, but as he was a drunkard, she refused and married another. Thereupon the lover shot himself, and soon after that event, a vampire, assuming his form, visited her frequently at night, especially when her husband was absent. She could not see him, but felt his presence in a way that could leave no room for doubt. The medical faculty did not know what to make of the case. They called it hysterics, and tried in vain every remedy and pharmacopoeia, until she at last had the spirit exorcised by a man of strong faith.
Keep this woman, O King of Kings, beneath thy almighty wings. O God, the spirit of all our joys."
A story related by Dr. Franz Hartmann concerns a, quote, "healthy servant boy who soon after entering the service of a miller began to fail in health. He had a ravenous appetite, but nevertheless grew daily more feeble. Being interrogated, he at last confessed that a thing which he could not see, but which he could plainly feel, came to him every night and sat upon his stomach, drawing all the life out of him, so that he became paralyzed for the time being and could neither move nor cry out. Thereupon the miller agreed to share a bed with the boy and proposed to him that he should give him a certain sign when the vampire arrived. This was done, and when the sign was given, the miller grasped the invisible but very tangible substance that rested on the boy's stomach. And although it struggled to escape, he grasped it firmly and threw it into the fire. After the boy recovered his health and there was no repetition of the vampire's visits. Dr. Hartman adds to this last account, quote, "Those who, like myself, have on innumerable occasions removed astral tumors and thereby cured physical tumors, all find the above not incredible nor inexplicable." If there is any truth to this subject, the astral or energy vampire theory seems to be the most plausible explanation. And yet, like all things of this nature, there are always exceptions, cases that suggest both physical and non-physical events transpiring, rendering the phenomenon almost incomprehensible. For example, one account tells of a vampire who was run through with a lance and instantly vanished, along with the weapon. When the grave was inspected, which had no sign of forced exit, the same lance was found in the corpse. Another puzzling anomaly was that the vampires were sometimes observed to have dirty feet, as if they had been walking, though the grave again was undisturbed. There are even stories of vampiric ghouls, which appear to be purely physical, rotting corpses, and literally consume the flesh of dead bodies, something more akin to what we would today identify as a zombie. The Tasmanian Aborigines held the custom of guarding the body of the deceased on the first night after death, to prevent it from being stolen and eaten by such beings. The Chinese vampire, the Jiangshu, or hopping vampire, earned its name by the fact that its rigor mortis prevented it from bending its limbs, thus forcing it to jump in order to move. This appears to be a purely flesh and blood creature, and yet it was thought to consume qi rather than blood. The Russian Vieksi was thought to, upon first waking, gnaw at and consume its own flesh. One of these ghouls was also recorded in Ireland. Quote, "A vampire story is also related concerning an old Cumberland farmhouse, the victim being a girl whose screams were heard as she was bitten, and who only escaped with her life by thus screaming. In this case, the monster was tracked to a vault in the churchyard, where 40 or 50 coffins were found open, and their contents mutilated and scattered around. One coffin only was untouched, and on the lid being taken off, the form was recognized as being that of the apparition which had been seen, and the body was accordingly burnt when the manifestations ceased. This type of being is also featured in a story out of the Middle East. Quote, "In the beginning of the 15th century, there lived at Baghdad an aged merchant who had grown wealthy in his business and who had an only son to whom he was tenderly attached. He resolved to marry him to the daughter of another merchant, a girl of considerable fortune, but without any personal attractions. Abu Hassan, the merchant's son, on being showed the portrait of a lady, requested his father to delay the marriage till he could reconcile his mind to it. Instead, however, of doing this, he fell in love with another girl, the daughter of a sage, and he gave his father no peace until he consented to the marriage with the object of his affections. The old man stood out as long as he could, but finding that his son was bent on acquiring the hand of the fair Nadila, and was equally resolute not to accept the rich and ugly lady, he did what most fathers under such circumstances would do. He acquiesced.
Grace and peace to you.
Oh, thank you very much.
The wedding took place with great pomp and ceremony,
You may kiss the bride.
and a happy honeymoon ensued, which might have been happier but for one little circumstance, which led to very serious consequences. Abul Hassan noticed that his bride quitted the nuptial couch as soon as she thought her husband was asleep, and did not return to it an hour before dawn. Filled with curiosity, Hassan, one night, feigning sleep, saw his wife rise and leave the room. He rose, followed cautiously, and saw her enter the cemetery. By the straggling moonbeams, he saw her go into a tomb. He stepped in after her. The scene within was horrible. A party of ghouls were assembled with the spoils of the graves they had violated, and were feasting on the flesh of the long-buried corpses. His own wife, who, by the way, never touched her supper at home, played a no inconsiderable part in the hideous banquet. As soon as he could safely escape, Abul Hassan stole back to his bed. He said nothing to his bride till next evening, when supper was laid and she declined to eat. He then insisted on her partaking, and when she positively refused, he exclaimed roughly, "Oh yes, you keep your appetite for your feast with the ghouls." Nadila was silent. She turned pale and trembled, and without a word sought her bed. At midnight she rose, fell upon her husband with her nails and teeth, tore his throat, and having opened a vein, attempted to suck his blood. But Abul Hassan, springing to his feet, threw her down with a blow and killed her. She was buried the next day. 3 days after, at midnight, she reappeared, attacked her husband again, and again attempted to suck his blood. He fled from her, and on the morrow opened her tomb, burnt her to ashes, and cast them into the Tigris.
It is the bloody business which informs thus to mine eyes. Now, o'er the one-half world, nature seems dead, and wicked dreams abuse the curtain's sleep. Now witchcraft celebrates pale Hecate's offerings, and withered murder, alarmed by his sentinel, the wolf whose howls his watch, thus with his stealthy pace, with Tarquin's ravishing stride towards his design, moves like a ghost. Thou sure and firm set earth, hear not my steps which way they walk, for fear thy very stones prate of my whereabouts, and take the present horror from the time which now suits with it. Whilst I threat, he lives. Words to the heat of deeds too cold breath gives.
As I mentioned at the start of this journey, the undead vampire was not the only form of this phenomenon. Another variant was the living vampire. That is, a person who, by means of magical abilities, fed on the life essence of other human beings. This was done through the intentional separation of the etheric or astral body from the physical body, not unlike the methods we explored in the previous episode on shamanism and similar practices. A common name for this is the double, as it retains the consciousness and often the appearance of the person. Through this projection of the double, the practitioner was evidently more effective in these vampiric designs. In southern Europe, it was believed these witches could take on spectral forms completely invisible to the eye, or appear as a small wisp, slipping through a keyhole or crack and entering people's homes. In Southeast Asia, tales of these vampire witches are prevalent. In Malaysia, she is known as the Penanggalan, a monstrous witch who preyed on villagers and drank their blood. She was said to have a particular predilection for newborn children. After submerging her body into a bath of vinegar, her head detached from her body, which then moved around by floating, trailing a string of entrails behind it. There is also the manananggal of the Philippines, a word which literally means separator, usually a female whose detached upper body takes on the form of a winged beast similar to a gargoyle. It used its long proboscis tongue to feed on pregnant women and suck the hearts of their unborn. I believe these stories where the witch detaches a part of the body may be a metaphor for out-of-body trance states, projection of the double. A more overt reference can be found in the lore of the Surinamese of South America, regarding the Asima, a witch that is said to remove his or her skin and fold it neatly before stalking the night in the form of a blue orb. In Wallachia, a historical region of Romania, the Moroni is said to be a living man who shapeshifts into various animals in order to hunt and feed more effectively. This is perhaps the origin of the popular image of the vampire turning into a bat. We will be reminded here of the previous episode on shamanism, where we found shapeshifting to be one of the abilities of the spirit double.
When I turn into a bat, there's no real skill to it at all. I just shout, "Bat!"
Throughout Europe, in the time leading up to the 15th century, a new universal image of the witch was being formed by a relatively small number of church clerics, which would serve as the template for convictions of the early modern witch trials. This image was created through an amalgamation of folk beliefs, notably a vampiric flying demon of the Mediterranean. Scholar Ronald Hutton posits, in the Alps and Pyrenees, and the lands immediately south of them, a rich crop of folkloric motifs features in prosecutions for witchcraft, one of them certainly very ancient. This is the figure of the Strix, the night-flying, child-killing female demon. By the Middle Ages, if not earlier, it was being merged with that of the human witch, and this composite directly underlies the formation of the early modern stereotype of the satanic witch. He further elaborates that in Italy the word strix came to be defined as witch, and eventually the modern word strega. The next ingredient added to the cauldron was allegations of sacrilegious rituals which epitomize Christian notions of heresy, meant to invoke shock and fear in the populace. For example, one accusation leveled against supposed witches was that they used the blood of children and child sacrifice in their rites. A 1438 text on witchcraft describes an initiation whereby the witch would drink the blood of murdered infants from a flask in a church. Almost always, the activities ascribed to them involved blood drinking, especially targeting children. Italian witch hunter Gianfresco Mirandola wrote that it was the witch's wont to prick babies with needles and drink their blood. The witch became the archetypal anti-human who was part of a far-reaching satanic conspiracy, conscripted by the devil himself in a concerted effort to destroy the Christian world. The leaders of this campaign effectively lumped together relic pagan practices, all forms of magic, from folk to ceremonial, as well as alternative Christian sects, into this mold. In fact, most of the people charged, even those who were actually practicing magic, still identified as Christians. These allegations have all but been proven by scholars to be fabrications, resulting from a complex of socio-political pressures and power agendas of the period. Even several state and religious authorities of the time, some of which were involved in the trials, were still skeptical of or outright dismissed the ideas as fantasy. The suspected witches were brutally tortured until they confessed to the crimes which had been imputed to them, rendering their testimony inadmissible by today's standards. However, new research has uncovered historical documents which strongly suggest that the medieval concept of the witch developed by the Christians was in part based on older pagan beliefs. This type of evil witch character is commonly distinguished in many cultures as a superhuman entity with an almost mythical status, distinct from the average people who practiced magic. The Tswana people of Botswana, for instance, distinguished the two as day sorcerers and night witches. The night witches were evil crones who held nocturnal gatherings, smearing their naked bodies with blood and assaulting people in their homes. They were attributed with the ability to put their victims into a deep sleep from which they could not wake, and enter houses even when the doors were locked. On the Trobriand Islands, there was also a belief in a similar witch who could fly and become invisible, meeting atop the reef beds to plot their wicked schemes. It was believed that they would harvest organs from living humans for their gruesome cannibal feasts.
Hungry.
While human sorcerers were thought to cause lesser misfortune, these witches were believed to be responsible for major catastrophes. Of particular interest to scholars in tracing the development of the medieval witch figure is the pagan Germanic belief in a cannibal witch, referenced in a code of law instituted by King Clovis of the Franks in 507 AD, which imposes strict penalty against a stria who eats a person. This variation of the Roman strix, according to Hutton, suggests a native belief in a similar night-flying witch. This record also imposes a fine on anyone who falsely accuses someone of being a witch or being an accomplice to a witch, specifically one who carries a cauldron to where the stria do their cooking.
Thou stool for
a witch, thou sodden-witted lord, scurvy valiant ass.
Yet another fine would be issued against anyone who killed a slave under the suspicion of them being a witch, because, quote, in no way should Christian minds believe that a woman can eat up a living human being from within. In 789, the Holy Roman Emperor Charlemagne declared to the conquered Saxons being forcibly converted to Christianity that, quote, if anyone, deceived by the devil, believes, as is customary among the pagans, that if any man or woman is a striga and eats men, and on that account burn that person to death or eat his or her flesh, he shall be executed.
Kill the witch!
In the year 1000, a Swiss monk remarked that, quote, whereas savage foreign tribes were said to practice cannibalism, here at home the witches were said to do the same. In the 13th century, a belief is recorded among the French and Germans of women who flew into people's homes and dissolved their bones from within before sucking their blood. The evil witches whom the Benedetti of Italy battled during their spirit journeys were also believed to drink the blood of children, causing them to slowly waste away. The Roman Catholic bishop, Bouchard of Worms, gave penance to women who labored under the delusion that while they slept, their souls would leave their bodies, banding together to harvest human organs and flesh, then restoring their victims to life by replacing their missing parts with straw and wood. It is interesting to note here that at the time, these beliefs were actually being discouraged by the church, suggesting a pre-existing tradition. Some of the witch trial campaigns gained momentum in part due to local fears of witchcraft that were already present. In those cases, they were simply given a scapegoat. The concept of black vampiristic magic appears to be universal and far predates any Christian belief system, and so this subject as a whole remains worthy of serious inquiry. Throughout history, there undoubtedly existed people who sought to wield magic in order to harm or exploit others, and still to this day, there are people who claim to do the same. On a final note, it should be said that while some of the witches mentioned were thought to consume the body rather than drink the blood, we can probably assume that because the practices are often mentioned together, that they functioned in a similar manner and represented the same process of subtracting one's life essence and adding it to one's own, for the purpose of gaining some sort of magical power. In many descriptions of medieval witchcraft, it was claimed that the blood and other human bodily substances were distilled into magical ointments, which were then used to anoint the body, conferring powers such as invisibility, flight, and shape-shifting. Nightly from my narrow chamber driven, come I to fulfill my destined part, him to seek to whom my troth was given, and to draw the lifeblood from his heart. He hath served my will, more I yet must kill, for another prey I now depart. Fair young man, thy thread of life is broken. Human skill can bring no aid to thee. There thou hast my chain, a ghastly token, and this lock of thine I take with me. Soon must thou decay, soon thou wilt be grey. Dark although tonight thy tresses be. Mother, hear, O hear my last entreaty. Let the funeral pyre arise once more. Open up my wretched tomb for pity, and in the flames our souls to peace restore. When the ashes glow, when the fire sparks flow, to the ancient gods aloft we soar. The Bride of Corinth. The following is a true account of what was believed to be a living vampire. The story took place in some area of the tropics where a number of English officials were stationed. It relates that several of these officers complained of strange, unexplained illness, which would only alleviate when they left the area. The focus of the story then centers on one of the men's wife, who begins experiencing paranormal phenomena. Quote, "The wife of the district medical officer, living in the same area, began to fail in health and became terribly depressed, apparently from no cause whatever. Previously, she had been a cheerful, happy woman, indulging in games and outdoor sports of all kinds. But now she became most depressed and miserable. At last, one night, about 12 o'clock, she woke up shrieking, and said she had woken up with the most awful feeling of depression, and had seen a creature traveling along the cornice of the room. She could only describe it as having a resemblance to something between a gigantic spider and a huge jellyfish. Her husband ascribed it to an attack of nightmare, but he was disturbed in the same manner on the following night. His wife said that she had been awake for a quarter of an hour, but had not the strength to call him before. She found her in a state of collapse, pulse exceedingly low, temperature 3 degrees below normal, pallid, and in a cold sweat. He mixed her a draught which had the effect of sending her to sleep. In the morning, she said she must leave the station and go home. Thinking to divert her attention, her husband took her away on a pleasure trip, when he was glad to see that she had entirely recovered her former cheerful expression and high spirits, until, returning home in a rickshaw alongside her husband, her face changed and resumed her gloomy countenance. "There," she said, "is it not awful? I have been so well and happy all week, and now I feel as though a pall has been thrown over me." On another occasion, she asked her husband to inspect the back of her neck for a bite mark, but he could find nothing of the sort. She then recalled a dream. Quote, "Now," said his wife, "I can tell you what is the matter. I dreamed that I was in a house where I lived when I was a girl. My little boy called out to me. I ran down to him. But when I reached the bottom of the stairs, a tall black man came towards me. I waved him off, but I could not move to get away from him, though I pushed the boy out of his reach. The man came towards me, seized me in his arms, sat down at the bottom of the stairs, put me on his knee, and proceeded to suck from a point at the upper part of the spine, just below the neck. I felt that he was drawing all the blood and life out of me. He then threw me from him, and apparently I lost consciousness, as did he. As he did so, I felt as though I was dying. Then I woke up, and I had been lying here for a quarter of an hour or 20 minutes before I was able to call you. Have you ever experienced anything of this character before?" asked her husband. "No, I have not. But night after night for many months I have woken in exactly the same state, and that has been the sole cause of my mental depression. I have not said anything about it because it seems so foolish, but now I have had this definite dream, and I cannot hold my tongue any longer." She soon passed into a peaceful sleep, and on discussing the matter on the following morning with her husband, she said, "I have a feeling somehow that it will not happen again. I feel quite well and strong, and all my depression is gone." In the afternoon, the husband and wife were going together to the club, when around the corner of the jungle came a tall Indian, the owner of a large number of cattle, and reputed to be a wealthy man. The surgeon's wife suddenly stopped, turned pale, and said immediately, That is the man I saw. In my dream.
That makes me so mad!
The husband went directly up to the man and said to him, "Look here. I will give you 12 hours to get out of this place. I know everything that happened last night at midnight, and I will kill you like a dog if I find you here in 12 hours' time." The Indian disappeared the same night, taking with him only a few valuables and a little loose money. He left behind him the money that was deposited in the bank, as well as the whole of his property. His 40 head of cattle, worth $80 each, were impounded, and no news has been heard of him 5 years afterwards. Since his departure, no one has complained of depression or lassitude in the area. These violent delights have violent ends, and in their triumph die, like fire and powder, which, as they kiss, consume. William Shakespeare. Whether or not there is any reality to the vampire, it certainly speaks to a psychological reality. On one level, the vampire seems to exemplify our dark desires, our hedonistic impulses. In this sense, blood itself represents the forbidden fruit. But beyond this, perhaps it most truly represents the state of active addiction. The inability to find fulfillment from one's own inner peace gives way to an insatiable need to gain a sense of wholeness from external sources, which degrade one's humanity and ultimately cause a person to become self-absorbed and violent out of necessity, as ultimately such an existence can only be maintained at the expense of others. The former is symbolized in the vampire transformation, and the latter in the consumption of another person's life force. The addict suffers suppression of rational thought as they become obsessed with the object of their addiction, as they are unable to function without it. Quote, "Everyone knows the phenomenon of trying to hold your breath underwater. How at first it's all right and you can handle it. And then as it gets closer and closer to the time when you must breathe, how urgent the need becomes, the lust and hunger to breathe. And then the panic sets in, when you begin to think that you won't be able to breathe. And finally, when you take in the air and the anxiety subsides, that's what it's like to be a vampire and need blood." Francis Ford Coppola. What begins as a choice of free will ends in slavery to one's own impulses. A person in this state can only find temporary satisfaction, so they are driven to ceaselessly feed their addiction. We find all of these characteristics in the vampire. It is no coincidence, then, that the people who were said to become vampires had often exhibited these traits in their lives. Others were turned by harboring intense negative emotions, which is in itself a form of addiction. As I've said before, addiction can manifest in many ways, beyond simply the use of substances. The evil sorcerer became addicted to power, as do the corrupt politicians and business tycoons in the world today. Like any drug, they will always have to seek more to achieve the same effect. All of these examples can be considered earthly attachments, which were believed to keep a part of the soul attached to the physical plane, existing in a liminal state, neither living nor dead, but undead. A person can experience this undead state psychologically as well, as their condition deadens their ability to feel joy. In Jungian psychology, the vampire has been suggested to represent the shadow, the undesirable, unconscious aspects of the psyche, which we tend to try to suppress and eradicate. Many are not even aware of or do not believe in its existence at all. The whole dilemma of discerning whether or not vampires are real, and exactly what they are, reflects the inner struggle of coming to terms with the shadow. By our efforts, it should be dead, and yet it is not. Jung himself also acknowledged the idea of psychological vampires, people with egotistical personality traits that lead to exclusively predatory and parasitic relationships with others. In contemporary psychology, this type of person is identified as having narcissistic personality disorder. Austrian psychoanalyst and professor of psychiatry Otto Kernberg typified the narcissistic personality as having a, quote, very inflated concept of themselves and an inordinate need for tribute from others. Capable of only shallow emotional life, they have difficulty experiencing any empathy for the feelings of others. Their ability to enjoy life, except for their experiences of their own grandiose fantasies and the tributes that they can manipulate others into giving them, is severely limited. They easily become restless and bored unless new sources are feeding their self-esteem. It is as if they have the right to control and possess others, and to exploit them without feeling guilt, and behind the surface, which is very often charming and engaging, one senses coldness and ruthlessness. The literary reinvention of the vampire, which began with Bram Stoker's Dracula, presenting the vampire as a well-to-do and physically attractive being, is perhaps the best representation of this. In his book The Culture of Narcissism, Christopher Lasch defines a cultural swing towards egotism in the wake of modernity. He attributes this to the cultural move towards secularism and abandonment of community values. The vampire is now romanticized in the entertainment industry, which is perhaps a reflection of this culture of narcissism. Again, I would argue that, in essence, narcissism is simply another form of addiction, the addiction to feeding one's own ego. Beyond the hyper-individualistic and hyper-capitalistic milieu of modernity, the advent of social media seems to add fuel to this fire, acting as the perfect breeding ground for this type of pathology, encouraging people to gain fulfillment from the attention of others, soliciting tribute like the blood-drinking gods of old. It is reinforced as a cultural value by rewarding those who engage in it and devaluing people who don't have clout. While all of these things can be tools for good, they seem to have also encouraged a culture of vampirism, as people spend more time seeking attention than creating things that have value and the ability to elevate our consciousness. Instead, what is created is an imbalance in the forces of consumption versus generation, the end result of which may be a culture that consumes itself, like the hungry revenant locked inside its coffin. This is how we end up with things like reaction to reaction videos. On that note, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Before we go, I just want to thank Caroline Alexander for her generous donation. Every bit helps me achieve my goal of creating content full-time, so thank you so much. If you would like to support my work, you can do so through DonorBox, which is linked in the channel page. Just another reminder that I am always looking for more paranormal stories for the Encounters series. So if you have anything, please reach out to me by email, hiddenpassagepodcast@gmail.com, or you can now leave a voicemail through the SpeakPipe, and that will be linked in the links section on the channel page as well. If you'd like to be featured in an upcoming episode, please reach out. Take care, and I'll see you next time.